Today, we're taking a look at the development of French bomber aircraft in the interwar period, a topic which was voted on by channel supporters over on Patreon. Admittedly, this was voted on a couple of months ago, but what with having to suddenly move house, which involved packing up all of my books, and moving them several hundred kilometres just as the Australian summer was rearing its ugly head, and then having to partially renovate and repaint said house, things understandably got a little bit delayed as much of my research material was sitting in a pile of boxes in the garage. But we are here at last. This is also the beginning of a new setup where I'm putting most of the special video topics up for a vote over on Patreon. In fact, each tier now gets its own voting perks, which is part of a change I've made to try and give something extra back for all of the amazing support I've received over the past 18 months. So if you want to learn more about that, and maybe support the channel as well, there is a link down below, but of course, no obligation. The fact that many of you are just happy to hear me give glorified lectures on aviation history is fantastic as it is. Speaking of which, French bombers in the interwar period. To say this is something of a chaotic topic would be a massive understatement. During the interwar years, the French made all kinds of bombing aircraft. Some were very good, some were objectively bad, and some were designed with such eclectic requirements that it was a miracle they even worked. Many of them were also very, very ugly, which has given interwar French aviation something of a poor reputation, which in many cases it really didn't actually deserve. Condensing 2 decades of developmental history into a 1-hour-ish video was something of a challenge, and in fact I have completely failed at this task, which is why this is now a 2-part video. Today's video will focus on aircraft built to specifications drawn up before 1930, and part 2 will focus on the rest, though there is a little bit of an overlap. Now, due to the number of aircraft produced in this period, we will just be looking at them in general, and not in detail, as the topic is the development of all French bombers, rather than the specific history of a certain type, but many of these aircraft will probably get a dedicated video in the future as well. Now, I called bomber development in France chaotic, but why? Well, in the interwar period, the French Air Force went through several major changes, as did the French aircraft industry, as did the French government, and because of this, at various times, remarkably different schools of aerial doctrine were in vogue. Broadly speaking, the development of French bomber design went through 4 major phases. There was the immediate post-war phase that put an emphasis on the tactical support aircraft, which produced bombers that couldn't really be called true bombers at all. They were more so just very heavily aggressive reconnaissance planes. Then, in the early 1920s, and partly in parallel with these tactical aircraft, the French Air Force put more focus on developing an actual nighttime bomber force. And this ran on through the middle towards the late 1920s, and produced some fairly good designs that just weren't produced in particularly large numbers. Then we get to the third phase, which begins roughly in the late 1920s, starting at about 1927-ish, and ends around 1934-1935, and this is an interesting period for the French Air Force that sees the development of the multi-purpose combat plane, also called the Combat Battle Reconnaissance aircraft. This was a period that saw the French Air Force very enthusiastically believe that a twin-engine aircraft could be made to fulfill almost every role imaginable. If designed just right, a twin-engine aircraft could act as a bomber, a reconnaissance aircraft, a close air support weapon for the army, and it could even act as a giant, heavily armed interceptor that was designed to blow enemy formations out of the sky, and of course defend itself from other enemy fighters. This resulted in some appallingly mediocre designs that began to enter service in the early 1930s, a lot of which were still in service during the Second World War, and probably the biggest reason why the French Air Force, and specifically the French Bombing Force, have such an appalling reputation for this period. But they weren't the only part of the French bombing force that would see action against Germany at the start of the Second World War. The fourth phase of French interwar bomber development would finally see things return to normal, and some truly excellent designs would begin to take to the skies. But for various reasons that we'll get into later, it was often a case of too little, too late, as France was playing a losing game of catch-up with Germany, whose air force was technologically ahead by a couple of years by this point, which at the time was not a good disparity to have. And it led to the case where France had these really weird, often incredibly outdated machines going into combat alongside aircraft that looked a decade newer than them, even though the difference could only be a couple of years. Much of this ridiculous situation was due to the aforementioned changes in French aerial doctrine. This video will touch on the doctrine of the French Air Force, as it's necessary to understand what they were thinking when they were issuing the specifications for various bombers, but it won't be an in-depth exploration of said doctrine, as that is a topic for another video in the future, as we could literally spend hours on that particular topic. Additionally, depending on what source material you look at, which is an important distinction to make, French aerial doctrine can be interpreted quite differently. Though in general its failings are often considered one of the main factors that led to the fall of France in 1940, but for today we're more interested in the bombers, and I mean just the bombers. We'll focus on land-based aircraft only, as French naval and flying boats will be getting their own development video in the future as well. Now, to understand the interesting trajectory of the development of French bombers in the 1920s and 1930s, we need to look at the bomber force that evolved during the First World War. Since the dawn of powered flight, France had been at the forefront of aviation development, and it had established the world's first military air service, the Aéronautique Militaire, in 1910. France would also deploy what could be called one of the world's first dedicated bombing aircraft, and that was the Voisin 3. And like many early aircraft that featured at the start of the First World War, it looked more than a little bit interesting. In fact, it looked something not unlike a militarized bathtub. But to its credit, it was a very good militarized bathtub. Like many designs of this early period, it was a pusher biplane. It was powered by a 130 horsepower Samsung engine, which was a 9-cylinder water-cooled radial. It had a crew of 2, it could carry a bomb load of 150 kilograms, and it had a maximum speed of around 105 kilometers an hour. Now those numbers do sound very slow and very quaint as far as aircraft are concerned, but for 1914 those figures weren't bad at all. The Voisin 3 entered service in 1914, before the outbreak of war, and it would equip the world's first dedicated bombing squadrons in the French Air Force. And very quickly it became popular. Despite appearances, it was remarkably easy to fly. It had good stability and handling in the air, and it was incredibly durable, courtesy of a light steel airframe. Because of this, it could make forced landings without suffering too much damage, and it was able to operate from incredibly rough airstrips. This made it especially popular with the Imperial Russian Air Service, who often had appalling ground conditions to deal with when it came to fielding aircraft, and of the 1,300 Voisin 3s that were eventually built, over half of these would end up flying over in Russia. Another example of early French World War I bomber design would be the Cadron G4. This was first built in early 1915, and it would eventually be manufactured not only in France, but also in Britain as well as Italy. Designed as a reconnaissance bomber, it would be the first twin-engine military aircraft to be built in large numbers, with approximately 1,400 being built by 1916. It was powered by a pair of 80 horsepower Lejon 9-cylinder air-cooled rotary engines, which allowed it to get a speed of 124 km an hour whilst carrying a bomb load of 113 kilos. This was a smaller bomb load than the Voisin 3, despite the G4 being a larger aircraft, but this was because it was designed more for reconnaissance first and bombing as a secondary mission. That being said, it was employed frequently as a bomber for most of its operational life. The French would use it to attack land targets as far inland as the Rhineland in Germany, and the British Royal Naval Air Service would use the G4 for various attacks against German Zeppelin and seaplane bases in Belgium. By 1917, the bomber aircraft fielded by France had changed dramatically, and on the whole they looked far more conventional. One of the few outliers being the Voisin 10, which, despite looking like a shopping trolley with wings, was actually built in surprising numbers. Over 1,000 of these interesting aircraft were produced, and they served all the way up until the end of the First World War. But most other designs had moved on with the times. A couple of good examples of French bombing aircraft developed during this period were the Latécoère 5 and the Breguet 14. The Latécoère 5 was a reconnaissance bomber which entered service at around the middle of 1917. It had a wingspan of just over 18 meters, a crew of 3, and it was powered by a pair of 240 horsepower Lorraine Dietrich V8s, which gave it an approximate top speed of 170 kilometers an hour. Though there was nothing particularly wrong with this design, only about 300 of the Latécoère 5s would be built. This was partly because they were more of a reconnaissance aircraft than a bomber, as while they had a good range of 450 kilometers, they only had a very small bomb load of 150 kilos, but it was mostly because they were being rapidly replaced by what would be the most popular French bomber developed during the war, and that was the Breguet 14. This was the first French aircraft that was mass-produced that made use of duralumin alloys as the main construction material. This not only made the airframe stronger, but also made it considerably lighter. Combine this with a relatively powerful 300 horsepower Renault liquid-cooled V12, and it meant that the Breguet 14 could carry more than twice the bomb load, 355 kilos, at a higher speed of just under 200 kilometers an hour. This meant that the Breguet 14 could actually outrun some German fighters, and it could also outgun them. It fielded two 7.7mm machine guns in the rear for defense, and the pilot also had a single forward-firing machine gun as well. The Breguet 14 would become an incredibly popular machine by the end of the First World War. Eventually, during the war, and including the early interwar period, it would be operated by more than 20 different countries, and at the end of its production run, over 8,000 of these aircraft would eventually be built. With production numbers like that, it's not surprising that by the end of the war, France had the largest air force in the world, and the largest bomber force by a healthy margin. But despite this, none of those French bombers boasted a particularly large bomb load when compared to other powers. For example, the Breguet 14 had a bomb load of approximately 355 kilograms. This wasn't much when compared to the British Handley Page Type O, which could carry a bomb load of just over 900 kilograms. It was significantly less than the Caproni CA4, which could carry just over 1,400 kilos, and it was completely dwarfed by the German Zeppelin-Starkens, which could carry up to 2 tons of bombs. Now, this dramatic disparity was because of a shift in doctrine that had occurred during the war, and it was one of the 2 major factors that would influence French bomber design in the first half of the interwar period. By the end of 1916, the French High Command had drawn very different conclusions from their early experiences of the air war when compared to the British, the Germans, and the Italians. In those countries, there would be a gradual shift towards the development of long-range strategic bombers, with the goal being twofold. A, to reduce enemy morale by raining terror on their cities, and B, damaging or destroying their industrial capacity using long-range raids launched from far behind the front lines of battle. This was especially the case with Britain and Germany, who didn't even share a land border, and the development of their long-range bombing campaigns is quite well known, especially with the German Zeppelins. Now, the French, on the other hand, who were fighting a land war first and foremost, had begun to move in a very different direction. Their focus began to steer towards the use of light and medium bombers to serve as tactical support weapons. They would first and foremost conduct long-range reconnaissance missions, identifying and photographing key military targets such as artillery placements, supply depots, etc. They carried bombs so that they could attack these targets if they could, especially if they were undefended, but the information they brought back was far more important than the limited damage that these early bombing raids could ever hope to achieve. That is not to say the French completely ignored the development of long-range strategic bombers, and indeed, several commanders wholly appreciated the ability of attacking targets far beyond the range of artillery, but the heavy bombers that were in development by the end of the war were mostly a reaction to the long-range bombers that were being fielded and used by the Germans, because if Paris could be bombed by Germany, the Air Force had to field aircraft that could reply, lest they be viewed by the public as impotent. But on the whole, only a small group of officers in both the Air Force and the Army saw the potential of these long-range bombers, and because of this, they were built in very small numbers when compared to the light and medium tactical bombers that were used by the French Air Force in the last 2 years of the First World War. This application of bombing aircraft by the French had remarkably far-reaching ramifications. The very nature of a tactical aircraft implied a level of subordination of air power to land power. And for that reason, along with many others, the French victory over Germany was viewed as a complete victory by land, and that the French Air Force had been a mere side piece, a tool that helped the army do its job. And because of this, many believed that a dedicated air force would be unnecessary. On the surface, it was an argument that made some sense, as the Air Force on its own had a negligible impact on the overall outcome of the war, and it was supposed that the Air Force would just become another full-time branch of the army, much like artillery or cavalry. But unlike those two, aviation was still very much in its infancy. Aircraft were still developing, they were slow, unreliable, vulnerable, and before the war it was more or less completely untested as a military weapon. This point was argued to officers of the army by various officers of the Air Force, who appreciated that the aircraft would develop rapidly and thus have much more to offer in the future as a weapon of war, but their arguments pretty much fell on deaf ears. For the French, long-range bombing had delivered very little in the way of practical results, though the morale impact was appreciated, and after reviewing the results of the long-range bombing campaigns of Britain and Germany, the army was further reinforced in its views. It was agreed unanimously that aircraft should be used to aid the army in tactical operations first and foremost. They would conduct photography, reconnaissance, and artillery spotting, and then maybe, if absolutely needed, tactical bombing when required. This was an opinion that would be carried quite deep into the interwar period, and through a combination of politics, personal influence, and a healthy amount of figurative and literal bribery, the French army maintained a position of dominance in all councils on national defence, and this had a profound impact on the development and doctrine of the French Air Force, which, unlike the RAF that became the world's first independent air force in 1918, would remain subservient to the French army well into the 1930s. It will come as a little surprise then that the most popular aircraft developed during the early 1920s were ones that conformed to the school of thinking that the army was trying to impose: reconnaissance first, tactical support second. And yet, paradoxically, the first new bombing aircraft to be produced in the interwar period, and one of the most successful of its time, was a long-range heavy bomber, the blocky, slab-sided Farman Goliath. This aircraft would eventually have over 18 different subvariants, and although it was designed as a heavy bomber, the Goliath's biggest legacy would be the impact that it had on early commercial air travel in the opening years of the interwar period, but that is a focus for another day. As a bomber, it was initially developed in early 1918 as a response to the growing fleet of long-range aircraft that were being fielded by Germany. Though, as mentioned earlier, there was a small group of army officers who supported the development of heavy bombers, the biggest push for the development of the Goliath came from the French government and the French Navy, and obviously the French Air Force as well. The French government wanted to appease public concerns about France's lack of a heavy bomber force, as for most of the war they could field pretty much nothing that could effectively hit cities such as Essen, Frankfurt, let alone more distant targets such as Berlin, with anything more than a couple of hundred kilos of bombs, if that. Now, the French Navy were instead interested in having a heavy aircraft that could perform the role of an early torpedo bomber, as at the time they had doubts about the effectiveness, speed, and reliability of a single-engine torpedo bomber. Though, not too long after this, the British-built Sopwith Cuckoo would quickly do away with most of their concerns. As for the opinions of the French Air Force, they simply didn't want to be left behind in what was shaping up to be a new aerial arms race. Various aerial theorists in France, Britain, Germany, and Italy had begun to agree that a fleet of heavy bombers could seriously impact a war if used correctly, bombing an enemy's factories, and denying their armies vital supplies, particularly small arms ammunition and artillery shells. Though most in the army felt that the small size of bombs and the relative inaccuracy of air attacks seen thus far basically rendered this tactic effective on paper only, the air staff were far more optimistic, or pessimistic depending on what way you look at things, and they began to draw up plans for an ambitious bombing campaign that would be launched in the spring of 1919. For this bombing campaign, they of course needed something that they did not currently possess, and that was a heavy bomber. And the aircraft that they eventually selected was one developed by the Farman brothers. Known initially as the Farman F-60, it made its first flight in October of 1918. Though it was smaller than some of the bombers that were either being developed or actively fielded by both Britain and Germany, this was the biggest military aircraft built by France thus far, with a 28-meter wingspan, and because of this it quickly earned the nickname of Goliath. As initially designed, it was meant to carry a bomb load of 2,000 kilos, at an average speed of 150 kilometers an hour, across a range of 1,500 kilometers, which would have represented a significant upgrade in French bombing capabilities, had the war not ended a month later, and had its intended engine actually been used. It was meant to be powered by a new engine that was being developed by Samson, an 18-cylinder, 500-horsepower radial engine, but the development of this engine was abandoned, and the F-60 had to be flown with much weaker 9-cylinder radials that produced just 260 horsepower. Because of this, the bomb load had to be revised down to just 1,000 kilograms, and following initial flight tests where the F-60 presented stability concerns, the Army's interest in the project all but evaporated, and following the armistice, all military orders were in fact cancelled. The Goliath was then repurposed to form the backbone of the early French commercial air industry, and within just a few short years, various Goliaths were gallivanting across Europe, setting altitude records, crossing the Atlantic, and in general doing much to increase the prestige of French aviation. At this point, the army realised that they might have been a bit hasty in rejecting the Goliath, as it was proving to be thoroughly reliable, and although they did prefer their smaller tactical aircraft, the large bomber fleets that were being fielded by Britain and Italy meant that there was a growing need for France to also possess some sort of a heavy bomber force, and interest in a military version of the Goliath was renewed in 1921. This led to the development of the Farman F-60BN2, which became the first official version of the Goliath to enter military service. Employed as a night bomber, it had a crew of 3, a wingspan of 26.5 meters, and a loaded weight of approximately 5,400 kilos. This version still made use of the less powerful 260 horsepower radial engines, and because of this, the bomb load was limited to 1,040 kilos. This was either made up of smaller bombs that were held within an internal bomb bay, or larger weapons which were suspended on racks underneath the fuselage. The military Goliath was eventually built in a number of different models, some of which eventually featured better engines, which were usually license-built Jupiter engines which had an output of approximately 380 horsepower. Approximately 200 F-60s would eventually be delivered for both the Army and the Navy, along with a batch of approximately 60 floatplane versions which were built as the F-65. Though later, more powerful versions could eventually carry up to 3 tons of payload, it wasn't in service with the Army and the Air Force for particularly long, and it was already being phased out by the mid-1920s. The naval versions, some of which pioneered torpedo bombing techniques for twin-engine aircraft, were in service for much longer, albeit this was sometimes because there was literally no other alternative for much of the decade. But as these were mostly operated as torpedo bombers rather than normal level bombers, they don't really fall within the scope of today's video. The biggest drawback of the Goliath had been its speed, or rather the lack thereof. Its loaded cruising speed was a hilariously sedate 120 km an hour. Other aircraft were now emerging that were bigger and heavier than the Goliath, whilst also being significantly faster. This led to the development of the F-140 Super Goliath and the F-160 and its derivatives. The F-140 was an attempt to inject some much-needed power into the airframe, and for this, Farman used an engine of their own design, a 500 horsepower W12. 4 of them were installed in tandem pairs on the lower wing, and they drove 4-blade wooden propellers. Though it could carry 3,000 kilograms of bombs at a speed of 183 kilometers an hour, only a handful of these new Super Goliaths would be built. By this point, its structural design was deemed as being far too outdated by the Air Force, the Goliath being made primarily out of wood rather than metal. Instead, the Air Force would place an order for a new twin-engine all-metal bomber with one of Farman's competitors, something which we'll get to shortly. This rejection prompted the modernization of the entire design, and this led to the F-160 and the F-168 in particular, of which approximately 200 would be built for the French Navy. But as these were designed as naval torpedo bombers rather than conventional bombers, we'll put them aside for the time being. Aside from the Farman F-60, there were a few other attempts at producing multi-engine bombers in the early 1920s. But none of them were quite as successful, and collectively they would begin a somewhat worrying trend that saw French heavy bombers featuring increasingly adventurous design choices, which, though innovative, did lower the Army's opinion of these larger machines even further, as they appeared to be either too complex, too expensive, and sometimes were straight up rubbish. A good example of being too innovative and also too complex was the Latécoère 6. This was a 4-engine heavy bomber that was first exhibited at the Paris Aero Show in 1921. Not only was it unique in having one of the most visually unappealing profiles yet designed, with an underbite so pronounced it could bring orthodontists to tears, but it also had the distinction of being the first aeroplane to feature geodetic construction, something which would go on to considerable more fame in various designs by Vickers, notably the Vickers Wellington. But the Latécoère would predate the Wellington by well over a decade, and when it was first unveiled, it caused quite a sensation. All of its structure was made from metal, mostly duralumin alloys, and this made it one of the first all-metal bombers to be designed and then successfully flown, the claim of first being tied with 2 designs by British firm Bolt & Paul. The construction of the Latécoère 6 was highly complex. The wing was based on double eye-shaped cross-section spars. 9 spars were used in the upper wing, 6 in the lower, and all of this was covered in steel sheets that were used as a wing skin. The geodetic fuselage structure consisted of 2 repeating spirals of duralumin, one going clockwise, one going counterclockwise. These spirals connected at each intersection point, and they created a continuous chain of diamond-shaped frames, which were reinforced by longitudinal stringers. The result was a structure that was incredibly strong for its weight, and one which was particularly resistant to torsional loads. Though innovative, the Latécoère 6 was destined to remain a one-hit wonder. When it first flew, it was equipped with the same underpowered radial engines that had powered the earlier iterations of the Farman F-60, and to say it underperformed would have been an understatement. It could barely do 150 kilometers an hour. It was then re-engined with 420 horsepower license-built Jupiters in 1924, and it was able to achieve a max speed of just under 200 kilometers an hour with a simulated load of 2,000 kilos. Unfortunately, by this point, the Army and Air Force had pretty much lost all interest, as although it did perform reasonably well, they had by this point run the numbers on its construction. Not only did the complexity of its design all but guarantee a multiplicity of headaches when it came to putting this thing into mass production, but it was also far too expensive for the tight budget of the immediate post-war period. The Air Force formally rejected the aircraft for consideration towards the end of 1924, and it was scrapped at some point in the mid to late 1920s. Another design that tried its absolute best to be different was the Dyle Bacalan DB-10. This aircraft was as innovative as it was visually horrifying, and in the words of my girlfriend, who always has a brilliant turn of phrase when it comes to very strange aircraft, it looked like they bent a submarine the wrong way and then stuck a set of wings on it. That simile was hilariously suitable, as this was the company's first attempt at producing an aircraft, as their usual prerogative was shipbuilding, of all things, and they were clearly being very brave in pushing into new territory. Not only did the DB-10 feature an all-metal structure, but it had a strut-braced all-metal monoplane wing, and it utilized something known as blended wing construction to produce a semi-lifting body. Basically, the center section of the wing was built with a thick profile, which allowed the engine nacelles and the front of the fuselage to be blended into the shape of the aerofoil. This would allow the front center section of the aircraft to add to the generation of lift, and thus make it a more efficient airframe. This also had the added benefit of allowing a crew member to access the engines, the oil, and the fuel systems for in-flight maintenance, courtesy of a small door that was built into the steel firewall that separated the engines from the rest of the central body. This was a very radical concept for the time, and it wouldn't really be seen again for another decade until Vincent Bonelli championed his own designs, which were based along similar principles. Designed as a day and a nighttime bomber, the DB-10 would actually find itself being entered into the competition to find a replacement for the Farman F-60 Goliath. Nominally, it would operate with a crew of 4, it had a wingspan of 25 meters, it could carry a bomb load of approximately 1,300 kilos, and a pair of 480 horsepower license-built Jupiter engines allowed it a top speed of just shy of 200 kilometers an hour at sea level. It did not win the competition, as only one of these were built, and it was partly because of its incredibly radical design, and partly because it was remarkably underprotected. Though it was made of all-metal construction and it had an okay top speed, it only had one defensive position up in the, nose, which had two 7.7mm machine guns. This gunner position was also perilously close to the propeller arcs of the two fixed-pitch wooden propellers that would be spinning at uncomfortable speeds just a couple of feet in front, and producing an unacceptable level of prop wash for the nose gunner to deal with. Although it was knocked out of the competition, the unique design of the DB-10 would be carried on into other aircraft, such as the DB-40, which was a reconnaissance seaplane of which little is known, and the much less nebulous but considerably more adventurous DB-70, which was a 3-engine passenger transport, which itself would become the questionable foundation for another French interwar bomber profile that we will get to later. Though the F-60s were the first of several twin-engine long-range bombers to enter service with the French Air Force in the 1920s, and while other one-off designs were proving that large all-metal aircraft weren't far away, although they might look visually horrific, The majority of early 1920s French bombers would consist of aircraft built to the tactical support Doctrine, which had well and truly gained a stranglehold within the French General Staff, despite growing objections from the Air Force. In truth, they were not really true bombers at all, but rather very aggressive reconnaissance aircraft that could attack ground targets if the need arose, and also deal with any enemy reconnaissance bombers that came their way. Perhaps the best example of this concept would be the Breguet 19, which first flew in 1922. It was designed as a successor to the highly successful Breguet 14 of World War I vintage, and following flight trials it was ordered into service by the Air Force in early 1923. Initially, the Breguet 19 was meant to be powered by a 450 horsepower 8-cylinder liquid-cooled Bugatti engine, but as it turned out, this engine displayed a nasty tendency to vibrate itself to pieces in flight, or simply overheat and catch fire, which was not ideal, and because of this, the Breguet 19 was rather unique for this period, as it was trialled and then built with a whole series of different engines. These included, but were not limited to, the 500 horsepower Farman 12WE, the 420 horsepower Gnome Rhone Jupiter license-built engine, 500 to 600 horsepower versions of the new Hispano-Suiza V12, the 450 horsepower American-built Liberty engine, and at least 4 different versions of the Lorraine W12, which, depending on the version, produced anywhere between 400 to 720 horsepower. The combination of these high-powered engines, with an airframe that was made primarily of duralumin alloys, meant that the Breguet 19 was quite fast, with some models boasting top speeds in excess of 235 km an hour. Much like the Breguet 14 in World War I, this made the Breguet 19 faster than some fighters, and it could even take on many of the leading fighters of its day in a one-on-one fight without much risk of disgrace. The pilot could operate a fixed forward-firing Vickers gun with an interrupter gear, while the observer had twin 7.7mm Lewis guns on a scarf ring, and there was also another machine gun which the observer could use, which fired through an opening in the floor. Proving to be as remarkably versatile as its predecessor, the Breguet 19 would eventually be used for all kinds of roles: bombing, reconnaissance, escort duties, and even as a nighttime heavy fighter. As a bomber, it could carry up to 470 kilograms of bombs under the fuselage, or a collection of smaller bombs, up to 50 kilograms in weight each, in a vertical internal bomb bay. Although the French Air Force despaired of the idea that this light aircraft would ever be classed as a bomber, the Breguet 19 would prove to be incredibly popular. Approximately 2,700 of these aircraft would be built across several different variants, which for the interwar period was a significant number of aircraft to produce. And these didn't just serve with the Air Force and the Army. Approximately 70% of the Breguet 19s built would actually be export models. Major operators included Argentina, Belgium, Greece, Poland, Romania, Spain, Turkey, and Yugoslavia. Though a good number of these would be phased out of service by the late 1930s, the Breguet 19 saw a lot of action in the Spanish Civil War, as Spain had been one of the largest export customers, and it also saw service in the Balkans throughout the entirety of the Second World War. Along with having an excellent service record, it also set several performance records throughout the 1920s and the 1930s. It completed the first crossing of the southern Atlantic by air in 1927, and it set a world record for long-distance flight speed, averaging 188 km an hour over a distance of 5,000 km in 1929. On its own merits, the Breguet 19 could easily be considered one of the most successful aircraft of its class in the interwar period, but it often remains relatively unknown, as it was somewhat overshadowed by another French bomber/reconnaissance aircraft/fighter/flying multi-tool, and that was the Potez 25. This took the French Army's obsession with tactical support aircraft to a whole new level, and while this military monoculture was on the verge of falling out of fashion, the Potez 25 would prove to be their greatest interwar success story. It was built as a successor to an earlier design, which was the Potez 15, which was a light reconnaissance bomber, with extreme emphasis on the light, that entered service shortly after the Breguet 19. With a top speed in excess of 230 km an hour, and armed with up to 4 machine guns, depending on the variant, it also looked vaguely similar to the Breguet 19. But unlike the Breguet 19, the Potez was built mainly from wood rather than duralumin alloy, and as far as payload was concerned, the Potez 25 was something of a featherweight, as most variants could barely carry more than 200 kilograms. On paper, it actually appeared to be a straight downgrade from the Breguet 19, and in fact it was. But that was because it was designed with even more emphasis on tactical support. The army wanted something that was fast, agile, and that was able to conduct rapid reconnaissance of enemy forces and fight off anything that was sent to stop it. Bombing was now a completely secondary task, and one which was only to be carried out under the most favourable of circumstances, i.e. if the target was completely undefended, or if it was at night and there was poor visibility. Despite being technically worse, the Potez 25 would be built in considerably more numbers than the Breguet 19, mostly because it was cheaper and easier to build, which meant more aircraft could be attached to army units, and losses could be more easily replaced. In total, over 4,000 Potez 25s would eventually be built, both within France and under license overseas, making it one of the most produced aircraft of the entire interwar period. They would see active service with more than 20 different nations throughout the 1920s and 1930s, and many saw use during the Second World War. It would eventually fill the role of reconnaissance bomber, fighter bomber, liaison transport, artillery spotter, photographic aircraft, and half a dozen other niches depending on which country operated it, and some were still in service after the war in the late 1940s. The Potez 25 represented the zenith of the French obsession with producing light multipurpose reconnaissance bombers, and the second half of the 1920s would see a significant push in the development of larger twin-engine designs. This shift towards larger aircraft coincided with a slight increase in the autonomy of the French Air Force. Though it was still subordinate to the army, it was now allowed to pursue its own aerial development programs. Quite early on, the French Air Force had begun to shift its focus towards developing a nighttime bomber force, for both tactical and strategic operations. As aircraft developed during the 1920s, so did their capabilities as a weapon of war. They were able to fly over a longer range, at a higher speed, carry more potent weapons, and almost always a heavier payload. There was near unanimous feeling within the French air staff that in a future war, air power would have a much bigger part to play. And because of this, the offensive capabilities of France's bombing force would have to have its tactical role complemented by a strategic one. There was also another factor at play that led to increased calls for a dedicated bomber force, despite the army's arguments, and that was Germany. Though the Treaty of Versailles forbade the development of military aircraft, many French officers had no illusions that the previous war with Germany would be the last, and in the eyes of the Air Force, a civil airliner was merely a bomber lurking in disguise. The terror of the German long-range bombing campaign from the First World War had not been forgotten, and with the advancement of technology, there was now much talk in government of the future of aerial warfare, with some fearing bomber fleets raining down untold destruction if things developed along the current trajectory. Thus, the rapid development of all-metal aircraft in Germany in the 1920s alarmed the French air staff, and this led to a renewed interest in the development of multi-engine long-range bombers, and the French Air Force immediately sought out a replacement for the Farman F-60. As mentioned earlier, Farman themselves offered the F-140 Super Goliath as a replacement, But this aircraft would lose out to a much newer design, the Lioré et Olivier LeO 20. When it first flew in 1927, it represented the last successful and possibly sane bomber design that would enter large-scale production for a considerable time, and as such, the old-school-looking LeO 20 deserves a bit of a pat on the back. It was based on the failed LeO 12, of which only 4 prototypes had been built. They had been rejected as being too fragile, and one of these was modified into an improved night bomber, which served as the template for the LeO 20. Now, although it was designed as a night bomber, it was, of course, also designed to work for the army as well, and as such, the LeO 20 could fulfill various mission requirements. It was not only capable of performing day and night bombing, it could also perform low-level ground attack, observations, and reconnaissance, with provision for additional camera equipment in the bomb bay if needed. It had a wingspan of 22.2 meters, a loaded weight of just over 5,000 kilos, and it was powered by a pair of 480 horsepower license-built Bristol Jupiter engines, which drove 2-blade propellers. This allowed the LeO 20 to carry a 1-ton payload at approximately 200 km an hour across a range of 1,000 km. It had a crew of 3, and it was defended by 5 7.7mm machine guns, one of which was sometimes mounted in a new ventral turret, one that shared a similar design to the so-called dustbin turrets that came into fashion with British bombers during the same period. Now, sources do conflict on the assigned stations, aside from the pilots whose position was obvious. Some state that the nose, which came with a sort of windowed balcony that was in vogue at the time, held the navigator/observer, and that the bomb aimer was in the position amidships. However, this might be a case of mistranslated source documents, as with almost all bombers of this period, the bomb aimer was located in the nose. The LeO 20 was flown for the first time in the summer of 1927, following which it went through a flight testing program which was completed without incident, and its performance looked promising. It was predicted to have a cruising speed almost 70 km an hour faster than the Farman Goliath, and its performance even exceeded the most optimistic estimates that had been given by its designer. On the 16th of September 1926, it was able to carry its own empty weight, in payload, which was equal to around 2,700 kilos, over a distance of 1,000 kilometers at an average speed of 189 kilometers an hour. This immediately made the LeO 20 the most capable bomber of its class. In fact, it would hold various speed and weight records for the next couple of years, and a production order was immediately placed for 50 aircraft. This number would increase over the next 3 years, and by the end of its production run, approximately 320 of the LeO 20s would be built. By 1930, LeO 20s equipped at least 12 frontline bomber squadrons in the French Air Force, and more were being assigned to various training units. But despite being the nation's lead class of bomber, the LeO 20 was already halfway to becoming obsolete, both from the point of technology and due to a change in aerial doctrine. This led to an attempt to modernise the LeO 20, with the development of the quad-engined LeO 203, with the engines mounted in tandem pairs. The more powerful version of this, which then came as the LeO 206. Then there was the slightly obese LeO 207, and the innovative but visually displeasing LeO 208. A key feature of the latter two designs was a gondola-like extension that protruded from the lower part of the fuselage. This was sometimes known as the balcony, and aside from serving as a convenient place to sneakily conceal a few bottles of wine for long-distance flights, it also acted as an internal bomb bay, provided a more spacious station for the bomb aimer, accommodated additional fuel tanks for increased range, and allowed for a ventral turret to be installed that was less detrimental than the drag-inducing dustbin model. Though it was a dramatic transformation from the original model, only one example of the LeO 208 would be built, as by the time it made its maiden flight, it was already 1934, and there was only so much you could do to modernize a biplane design in a world which was very quickly transitioning to the monoplane.
This period of transition, which ran from roughly 1925 to 1935, saw rapid advancements being made in all fields related to aviation, and this transformative period gave birth to an exceedingly eclectic range of aircraft designs that would be presented to the French Air Force. It also coincided with yet another shift in French aerial doctrine. The creation of an independent air ministry in 1928 had given more impetus to the development of aircraft and aerial doctrine within the French Air Force. Now, the army still technically called the shots, but the French air staff were now both numerous and experienced enough that they had more than a modest amount of influence. This inevitably led to increased friction between the two services, and a gradual breakdown of communication and cooperation was beginning to have a negative impact on the aircraft being developed. And this was being further exacerbated by vocal individuals who were advocating conflicting theories on military aerial policy. Interestingly, two of the people to blame for this growing rift could not be found within the ranks of the French military, but were instead over the border in Italy. In 1921, General Giulio Duhay published a book that was titled Command of the Air, and a second edition was then printed in 1927. To say he was an advocate of strategic air power would be the understatement of the century. He believed that the first effort of air forces was to conquer the command of the air, that is, to put the enemy in a position where he is unable to fly, while preserving for oneself the ability to do so. His method of gaining superiority was to attack the enemy air force on the ground, and that aircraft in general must be used as aggressively as possible. He predicted that the most important role for a future air force would be the mass bombing of enemy cities and infrastructure, regardless of whether the target bombed was military or civilian. The end goal was the same: to pummel the enemy into submission, to break the people's will, and to cut off an army's supply at its source, people and factories. Though Duhay believed that some cooperation between the services of the Army, the Navy, and the Air Force would be essential to success, he also believed that the tactical and close support role of the Air Force was totally unnecessary, and that it would be a strategic Air Force that would become the dominant military arm of the 20th century, outclassing both the Army and the Navy. He foresaw huge fleets of long-range, heavily armed, heavily defended bombers as the standard for any air force. They would fly high above the range of anti-aircraft weaponry, they would blast any interceptor force out of the sky with powerful defensive turrets, and they would decimate the enemy below them with crippling bombing rates. Duhay theorized that the next major war that would be fought would be one of total war, with anything on the table, and his vision of this future war was both grand and grim. To get an idea of the nature of future wars, one need only imagine what power of destruction that nation would possess, whose bacteriologists should discover the means of spreading epidemics in the enemy's country. Air power makes it possible not only to make high-explosive bombing raids over any sector of the enemy's territory, but also to ravage his whole country by chemical and bacteriological warfare. It is entirely possible that some of Duhay's work, which was printed and translated in multiple different languages, had some sort of an impact on the 1932 Geneva Disarmament Conference, as during that conference bombing aircraft were discussed quite a bit, particularly due to the threat that they posed from not only bombing cities, but also acting as a vector for chemical weapons. Unfortunately, I have not found a direct link between his writing and the topics discussed at the conference, but it is not a far stretch to assume that there was some influence lingering in there. But Duhay was not the only one writing on the future of military aviation in Italy at this time. In fact, another Italian by the name of Amedeo Micozzi opposed his theories and instead championed the development of the attack or assault Air Force doctrine, which put emphasis on striking military targets rather than civilian industry. Unlike Duhay, who envisioned that the Air Force would become the dominant military arm in the future, Micozzi took a more cooperative approach and wrote extensively on how Army, Navy, and Air Force could complement each other depending on the nature of the conflict and specific operations involved. He argued that it was financially and practically impossible to amass an air force that was powerful enough to completely wipe out the opposing air force of an enemy, and thus their cities. And to quote the man himself, "To achieve command of the air is as much Duhay's legitimate aspiration as mine, but it is also the enemy's aspiration. Duhay always forgets this." Instead, Makosi called for a balanced air force, with a mix of fighters, strike aircraft, and bombers, which would cooperate with the other services. His writings on what this cooperation would involve were as comprehensive as Duhay's, but his summary of the assault doctrine was eerily prophetic when the aerial doctrines of future wars are considered. Let us amass together air and ground forces in the place and at the time that they are most decisive. While the air force inflicts decisive damage on the enemy, we should not allow the enemy to inflict damage on our own sea and ground forces. Both men and their arguments had their merits. Both had their flaws. Duhay, for example, believed that single-engine aircraft were a waste of energy and resources, and both were quite unwavering in their opinions, though, to be fair to Makosi, he was the more flexible of the two. But both were unified as being strong advocates for the advancement of air power, and the effects of their writings could be subtly felt in the development of various air forces all over the world. France was no exception, but instead of unifying army, navy, and air force officers in the idea of strong independent air power, it only served to deepen already established divisions and set the air force down a disastrous path. Some officers of the army found Makosi's writing enlightening, as it could maybe be interpreted as supporting their ideas of purely tactical air power, though this obviously wasn't the case. But they were almost universally united against the writing of Duhay, who not only advocated for an air force that was independent of their control, but for an air force that would eventually supersede them in importance. Logically, it was expected that the officers of the Air Force would find themselves supporters of Duhay, and those in the army who wanted to maintain the status quo were incredibly reluctant to give the Air Force any further strategic importance, lest a vividly verbose Italian give them any unwanted delusions of grandeur. But unfortunately for the army, with the formation of an air ministry, the Air Force now had a much greater amount of financial freedom. And although they were still absolutely required to produce aircraft to serve the tactical needs of the army, the Air Force also began to push for more funding for the development of a heavy bomber force. Now, to clarify, it should be said that despite the concerns of various army officers, not every Air Force officer wanted to abandon tactical warfare, per the writings of Duhay. Although almost all of them resented their relegation as a purely tactical and subservient force, not all of them believed that tactical operations in support of the army were unimportant, particularly as a good portion of the French Air Force officer staff were former army officers themselves, and thus had the benefit of seeing things from both perspectives. But many more officers also did agree with Duhay that the Air Force would take on a much greater importance in future wars, and as such so would the use of a long-range strategic bomber force. Though Anthony Baldwin's famous words that the bomber would always get through had not yet been spoken, many officers believed in this sentiment. It seemed obvious that where aviation was concerned, the best defense was a good offense, and if the nation wanted to avoid the inglorious fate of being wiped off the map by masses of German bombers, they had to field an even bigger bomber force themselves. This idea that the next future war would be fought in the air rather than on the ground alarmed officers of the French army, who insisted on having a full tactical support force. But the French government was not so certain. If Germany's ever-growing fleet of advanced civil aircraft suddenly turned into a fleet of advanced bomber aircraft, the nation could be in serious trouble. If the choice had to come between producing a tactical bomber force or a strategic one, it was believed that a long-range strategic force would have to take priority. Ironically, though the French could not know this at the time, the future German Luftwaffe would pretty much take the opposite approach when it came to their own bomber forces. But that was a future problem. For now, we come to the part where things begin to go a bit weird. Towards the end of the 1920s, a large portion of the French air staff became obsessed. Let's use obsessed. They became obsessed with the idea of producing a so-called Battle-Combat-Reconnaissance plane. This did not officially come into term until the early 30s, but its origins could be clearly seen in designs from the late 20s moving forward. In the broadest of nutshells, the Air Ministry became gradually convinced that if an all-out war erupted with Germany, every aircraft possible must be able to perform strategic roles if required. They would still happily produce aircraft that served the tactical needs of the army, such as reconnaissance, transport, the occasional low-level attack, etc., but these aircraft must also be capable of helping the Air Force contest ownership of the air, either by intercepting and destroying enemy air forces, and if necessary, take the war deep into the enemy's homeland to conduct mass raids on their cities and industry. This would require a multi-engine aircraft that was large, well-armed, fast, and most importantly, incredibly versatile. Basically, the Air Ministry wanted a true multi-role aircraft, which wasn't necessarily a bad thing, and, as the saying goes, a jack of all trades is a master of none, though often better than a master of one. But the problem was the technology wasn't quite there yet for this sort of endeavour, particularly with power plant design, which was starting to lag behind. And additionally, they were trying to place too many requirements onto a single airframe, whilst at the same time allowing for basically no specialization within the Air Force at all. The result of this would be a series of aircraft that were mediocre at best and downright impotent at worst. And as they were meant to fulfill multiple roles, they would make up the bulk of France's bombing force, both tactical and strategic, which meant that its ability to wage an effective air war was severely compromised, something that would have huge ramifications at the start of the Second World War, a point we'll get to later. Another factor which further affected the quality of these multi-purpose bombers was one that also reduced the quality of France's less numerous heavy bomber force, and that was its lack of capacity to produce said aircraft in the first place. The French aviation industry was in a state of decline by the late 1920s. Due to the army's disinterest in large bombing aircraft, not many had been produced in numbers outside of the old Farman F-60s and the LeO 20s. The development of large aircraft was also beginning to lack in the commercial sector, with a few exceptions, which made little progress in developing modern and competitive transport planes, or even developing the infrastructure of French airfields to cope with larger modern planes. This was not only the result of military neglect, but also that of waste, mismanagement, and even criminal fraud, which soaked up much of the funds provided to the French civil aviation industry. In fact, the growing corruption within the French civil aero industry would be one of the main trigger points that would lead to the entire aircraft industry being nationalized in the mid-1930s. And so, when the French Air Force suddenly called for the production of large multi-engine bombers, many manufacturers either lacked the facilities, the experience, the money, or sometimes all three. And this produced some truly terrible designs in the late 1920s, early 1930s, before yet another change in aerial doctrine shifted the design focus once more. Perhaps one of the earliest known iterations of the multi-seat, multi-role combat plane could be found in the Blériot 127 and 137, and coincidentally they were also the first of a whole group of French bombers that took a fanatical approach to function over form, as there really wasn't a single viewing angle that flattered the looks of these aircraft. Based on the Blériot 117, which was an abandoned attempt to build a heavily armed escort fighter, it was essentially the same aircraft, but with the word fighter crossed out and the word bomber hastily scribbled above it on a piece of paper. The prototype 127 made its maiden flight in 1926, and a revised version was ordered into production as the 127/2 in 1927. Power came from two Hispano-Suiza 12Hs, a water-cooled V12 which produced approximately 550 horsepower, which drove a two-bladed fixed-pitch wooden propeller. This allowed the 127 to achieve a top speed of 221 km an hour at 2,000 meters, whilst carrying a bomb load of approximately 1 ton. A standout feature of this aircraft was the unique positions of its defensive guns. A pair of 7.7mm machine guns were located in the nose on a flexible mount, which was perfectly normal for the time, but there were 2 other positions located at the rear of the engine nacelles behind the trailing edge of the wing, which was decidedly not normal. The wing was thick enough that these could be accessed internally via a door in the fuselage, and they offered a commanding field of fire that protected the majority of the bomber's rear hemisphere. With this, it was hoped that the 127 would be virtually impossible to attack, and it would also be powerful enough to serve as an effective bomber escort. However, by the time the 127 was entering service in 1929, it was becoming rapidly apparent that the biggest threat to the Blériot 127 was itself. Its defensive gunners, rather than engaging the enemy and blowing them out of the sky, were more occupied with battling the slipstream and choking on engine exhausts. As an escort, it was about as effective as a milk truck in a street race, being outpaced by the very fighters it was meant to protect against, and not to mention being outpaced by most bombers at the time as well. And, due to development creep, the airframe was overloaded, which led to the wooden wing structure spectacularly buckling in flight without any warning whatsoever. Unsurprisingly, this made the Blériot 127 unpopular with aircrews, funnily enough, and it was all but retired from squadrons in late 1933. But the 127 was not completely dead, as yet another redesign was submitted to a new specification that had been issued by the Air Force in 1928. This was the first time that the Air Force directly sought out its new multi-purpose combat plane, and it resulted in a quartet of designs that even today continue to give people reason to question the French air staff's sanity. And we'll begin with the Blériot 137. Rather than coming up with a new or revolutionary design, the Blériot design team focused instead on improving the 127 so that it A. had better performance, B. didn't try to fumigate its defensive gunners, and C. didn't fall out of the sky courtesy of buckled wing spars. And to their credit, they mostly succeeded. The all-metal Blériot 137 was a significant improvement, now featuring a reinforced high-mounted wing that was supported by struts that formed a framework that connected with the engine nacelles and the undercarriage, the latter of which now came in streamlined fairings. The defensive gunner positions had been moved inboard to the fuselage, so that they were not in line with the engines, and they were set slightly lower so that most of the slipstream travelled over the gunners' heads, rather than attempting to rip their faces off. 2 prototypes were built, the 137M0 and the M1, with the main difference being the power plant. The M0 was powered by 500 horsepower Hispano-Suiza V12s, and the M1 was powered by 500 horsepower Samsung radial engines. Not much is known about these 137s, as they would be the first design to be eliminated from the competition. Despite Blériot's improvements, they were the slowest designs of the 4 submitted, with a top speed of just 230 km an hour, and they had the smallest bomb load, which, depending on what source you read, was either just 500 or 750 kilos, a sacrifice which was made for the improvement of the airframe. The next in the 4 horsemen of the ugly French apocalypse was the SPCA 30. The SPCA standing for Société Provençale de Construction Aéronautique. My French is appalling, I know, but I think that was vaguely correct. This was unique in being one of the few twin-boom bomber designs that were developed in France during the interwar period, though there is another one which we will discuss later. It was an all-metal, low-wing monoplane which had a nominal crew of 5. At the front of the fuselage gondola was the gunner's position. In the central part, there were 2 pilots sat in tandem.
Behind them was the bomb bay, and this gave access to the tail booms, which each held a gunner station approximately halfway towards the tail. Much like with the design of the Blériot 137, this was intended to allow the defensive gunners to command a very broad field of fire. The SPCA 30 had a wingspan of 26.5 meters, a loaded weight of 6,500 kilograms, and its total bomb capacity was at 900 kilos. 2 prototypes of the SPCA 30 would be produced. The first had 650 horsepower Lorraine liquid-cooled W-18s, and the second had 650 horsepower Hispano-Suiza V12s. Knowing that they were entering into a very fierce competition, SPCA tried to cover all of their bases, so that the aircraft might still have a purpose if it were not selected by the French Air Force. It was designed with modularity in mind, and all of its major parts were designed to be easily interchangeable, and it was even designed to accept a detachable cabin that would go below the central fuselage so that it could either act as an ambulance or as a medium passenger transport. Unfortunately for SPCA, their endeavours would be just as fruitless as Blériot's, but for very different reasons. During a demonstration flight in front of many officials, including Paul Painlevé, the Minister of Aviation, and Marshal Pétain, who, incidentally, had gone from opposing the idea of strategic bombing to becoming one of its greatest supporters, the SPCA 30 did its absolute level best to try and convince them that it was not a winning design. It did this by attempting to disassemble itself shortly after takeoff. This was the result of a violent case of flutter that occurred in the 2 rudders when full power was applied to the engines. This caused the tail booms to violently and rapidly yaw back and forth, moving as much as 1 meter in either direction, which caused the wing to begin to shear away, and the gunners scrambled for their lives back into the central cabin. The altitude was too low to bail out, and so the pilot made a forced landing in a nearby military staging field, with the aircraft coming to a crumpled stop in an anti-tank ditch. Everyone on board except for the pilot escaped without much injury, but supposedly the vibrations travelling from the rudders, through the control cables and thus into the rudder pedals, was so strong and violent that they literally destroyed the poor pilot's shoes, his feet, obviously, and injured his legs to such an extent that he was hospitalized for months afterwards. Eventually, this problem was fixed, with the addition of weighted balancers to the rudders of the second prototype, but by this point the French Air Force had narrowed down its choice of aircraft to 2 others, and SPCA was out of the competition as well. The runner-up that almost won the competition to represent French aerial power in the early 1930s, and if it had, would probably have led to a summons to The Hague for visual crimes against humanity, was the Breguet 410. Though it looked like an antiquated relic from the previous decade, the 410 was surprisingly powerful, surprisingly innovative, and surprisingly fast. It was the first design to feature a fully enclosed set of defensive gun turrets, 1 in the nose, and 2 in the upper and lower rear, depending on the model that was built. Each was equipped with twin 7.7mm machine guns. It also made use of new construction methods that allowed for the production of a stronger airframe with less material, and this allowed the bomb capacity to be increased, with the 410 carrying the heaviest bomb load of the competition at 1,300 kilos. The prototype first flew in 1931, and it surprised observers by achieving a top speed of 310 km an hour, which was significantly ahead of the designs by Blériot and SPCA, despite the fact that the Breguet 410 appeared to have the drag profile of a mobile prefab office. However, despite this good top speed, and despite having an effective range of 1,300 kilometers, which was above the requirements, it was rejected by the Air Force, and in an attempt to regain the initiative, Breguet developed several follow-up prototypes that ultimately didn't get anywhere either, but they did look equally weird. As a result, the next version of the aircraft, the Breguet 411, was built and completed in early February 1932. It differed only in minor internal modifications, and because of this it was also rejected. There was then the Breguet 413, which was re-engined with the new Hispano-Suiza 12Y, which produced 780 horsepower. Driving new 3-blade propellers, this promised top speeds in excess of 330, maybe 340 km an hour, and 4 aircraft were ordered for further testing, but they were also eventually rejected. One of these would eventually find its way into the International Volunteer Squadron, and it would be operated by the Republican forces in the Spanish Civil War. The next variant, the Breguet 14, was instead equipped with radial engines to further improve the type's resistance to potential battle damage, but any other improvements were negligible, and this too was rejected in 1933. And finally, the Breguet 420 was an attempt to completely modernize the design. It came with a streamlined fuselage, cowled radial engines that were now pushing in excess of 800 horsepower, and it featured a new retractable ventral turret. But, like most retractable turrets of its time, the idea was good on paper, but not so much in practice. When retracted, it did improve the streamlining considerably, but when deployed it vibrated quite severely, and small gaps allowed cold wind to rush in at a shrieking pace, which all but deafened the poor gunner who was strapped inside. Now there was one other offshoot of this design, which sought to improve things further, but as that was designed to another specification that was issued after 1930, we'll leave it aside for now and talk about it in part 2. The aircraft that would win the competition, and to be selected as the Air Force's first multi-role combat plane, would be a design by Amiot. It began as the least visually offensive of the designs submitted, but unfortunately this would not last, and various versions of what became known as the Amiot 140 and then the Amiot 143 would go on to serve as the hilariously ugly poster child for the French bomber force for a number of years. Now, the original prototype, the 140, was a relatively streamlined all-metal high-wing monoplane, and it made its maiden flight in April of 1931. It had a crew of 4, a wingspan of 26.4 meters, a loaded weight of just over 5.5 tons, and it could carry a 1-ton bomb load. It was meant to be powered by a 690 horsepower Lorraine W12 liquid-cooled engine, but at the time of the prototype's completion, these were not available, and this required a hasty refit to slightly less powerful 650 horsepower Hispano-Suiza V12s. Despite this drop in power, the Amiot 140 still performed well, and in the competitive trials, it achieved a top speed of 325 km an hour. Each of the other competing designs had a fairly unique visual feature, usually a result of trying to get to the best field of fire possible for the defensive guns, and the Amiot 140 was no different. Its unique feature was a gondola-style fuselage, like the one seen on the experimental LeO 208. This housed the bomb bay, which contained bombs held in vertical racks, the bomb aimer station, the radio and navigation station, a ventral gunner position, and it acted as an excellent reconnaissance platform, courtesy of the large windows that provided visibility on all sides. Now, this did have one disadvantage, as glass was usually a fairly poor replacement for metal from the point of protection, and this meant that the crew members housed here would be very exposed to incoming fighter fire and flak shells, as they were essentially sitting in a floating terrarium. Additionally, the gondola was quite cramped, and this meant that the ventral gunner had difficulty traversing his gun far beyond the centre line. This did not dissuade the French Air Force, though. At the conclusion of the design competition, the evaluation of which ran on for well over a year, the 140 was considered the best aircraft presented, and they placed an initial production order for 40 aircraft in November of 1933. That is not to say that the French Air Force were completely happy with the design. They felt that the 140 focused too much on the bombing role, and that it wasn't as well rounded as they would like. In fact, many felt that all of the aircraft offered in this specification were quite disappointing, and that the 140 was merely the least disappointing of the lot, which was why it was ordered. Aware of the aircraft's shortcomings, Amiot had already begun a redesign of the 140 before this production order had even been placed. The gondola under the fuselage was enlarged, allowing easier operation of the aircraft's guns and an increase in size of the observation windows, thus turning it into a weaponized greenhouse, and a radio operator was added which brought the crew up to 5. Manually operated gun turrets were installed in the nose and in the dorsal positions, and orders were placed for 2 prototypes, differing only in the engines fitted, with the Amiot 142 having Hispano-Suiza 12Ys, and the Amiot 143 having Gnome Rhone radials. The 143 flew first on August 1st, 1934, and the 142 flew in January of 1935. With the Hispano-Suiza engines being given priority installation in fighter aircraft, only the radial engine Amiot 143 was then put into service. The existing order for 40 Amiot 140s were modified to 143 specification, as construction had barely begun, and eventually approximately 138 of these strange-looking bombers would be produced. The combination of the enlarged gondola, the chunky radial engines, and several other minor changes to the undercarriage and the nose made the 143 a particularly painful machine to look at. Now, the French had wanted a terrifying weapon with which to command the air, and at least from the point of psychological warfare they had done this to admiration. But although the 143 would try its best to be a multi-role aircraft, for reasons we will discuss later, they were fairly hopeless by the time that they saw real action. They first entered service in mid-1935, and most deliveries were complete by the start of 1938, with the aircraft forming a considerable chunk of France's bombing force. This meant, of course, that they would feature in the opening phases of the Second World War, but by this point they were already hopelessly obsolete. Not only were they superseded by newer designs, but they weren't particularly good in any specific role in which they were used, though mainly they were only operated at night. This usually consisted of various leaflet raids over Germany during the early period known as the Phony War, and following the invasion of France, they were then used for nighttime attacks on German airfields and railway stations. The few aircraft that were used in daylight for either bombing raids or reconnaissance missions were quickly overwhelmed by German fighter aircraft, who were not only considerably faster, but were incredibly well armed. Following the fall of France, 50 or so of the 143s would serve in the Vichy Air Force, mostly in Africa, and some of them would eventually wind up in Allied hands after Operation Torch, but they would spend most of the war in secondary roles, mostly as transports, and they were all scrapped by the end of the conflict. Now, at the same time that all of this had been going on, the French Air Force had not neglected to continue the development of its heavy bombers either. But with the exception of a single design, these too would turn out to be enormously disappointing. Dyle et Bacalan, for example, produced a pair of horrendously frightening aircraft in the form of the AB-20 and AB-21. Looking like something that had come straight out of a steampunk novel, these were a pair of 4-engine heavy bombers that were based on the design of the 3-engine DB-70, which itself wouldn't look out of place in said steampunk novel, as it was an airliner that not only featured a full-on dining cabin in the centre, but it also had a viewing gallery built into the wings. The AB-20 had a wingspan of 37 metres, a loaded weight of 14,600 kilos, and it could carry a bomb load of 2.5 tons. When it made its maiden flight in January 1932, it was technically the largest military aircraft currently being flown by the French military. However, it was not ordered into production, as its performance was utterly abysmal. Despite being powered by 4 500-horsepower Lorraine engines, it had an operational range of just 850 kilometers, and it could barely manage a top speed of 210 kilometers an hour, a pace so slow that it would have been considered sluggish a decade earlier. It did mount a decent number of defensive weapons in the form of 5 7.7mm machine guns, but their layout was far from optimal. A single gun was mounted in the nose, half obscuring the view of the pilot's cabin, which was directly behind it. Two were mounted behind the pilot, but much of their rear arc of fire was blocked by the twin-boom tail, and the final pair were mounted in a retractable ventral turret of questionable reliability. Additionally, handling reports of its early flight trials had nothing favourable to say. It was difficult to manage on the ground and in the air, and its in-flight stability made the shaky French government appear as if it was built from granite. Attempts to improve this horrific design in the more streamlined AB-21, which first flew in 1934, also came to nothing. It featured a drastically redesigned airframe, which, despite appearances, was supposedly an attempt to make the aircraft more streamlined. It had a slightly reduced wingspan of 36.5 meters, and its weight had been reduced by almost 1.5 tons, but the only result from these efforts was an increase of just 10 kilometers an hour to its top speed, and the range was increased from 850 to 1,000 kilometers. Unsurprisingly, this aircraft was swiftly rejected by the Air Force as well, and it was scrapped at some point in late 1935. But hilariously, there were then attempts to repurpose the slow and bulky AB-20 into a heavy interceptor by mounting a quick-firing 75mm field gun as its primary armament. Now, this went about as well as any sane engineer would expect, and after firing approximately 5 rounds in a static test, damage was reported to the skin of the airframe, owing to the shock of the gun firing, and the idea of turning the AB-20 into a flying aerial tank was promptly abandoned. Another puzzling design was one that was produced by Avion Bernard, which decided that a single-engine long-range strategic bomber was the way to go. The Bernard 82 was drawn up as a so-called Repraisal bomber, and how nobody had ever had the idea to nickname it the Flying Baguette completely escapes me. It was a 3-seat, all-metal, low-wing monoplane, featuring an innovative retractable undercarriage, a thick and broad 27-meter wing, and it was powered by a single Hispano-Suiza 12 YBRS, which produced approximately 860 horsepower. It was a development from the long-range Bernard 80GR, which had been designed to set long-distance flight records. 2 prototypes were completed, the first flying in December 1933, the second in March 1934, and the Air Force placed a tentative order for 10 aircraft as a pre-production series. The Bernard 82 was to carry a 1-ton bomb load at a high altitude across a range of 2,800 kilometers, which for a single-engine aircraft at the time was suitably impressive. Aside from the crew, the electrical and the radio equipment, and of course the flight controls in the cockpit, most of the Bernard 82's important internal features were built within the thick-cored cantilever wing. 2 fuel tanks, which totaled 2,600 litres, were installed in the innermost section on each side of the fuselage. Then there was the hydraulics and recesses for the retractable undercarriage, and beyond that were a series of cells that acted as the bomb bay. These were loaded via a door that opened from the top of the wing, and they of course fell out of the bottom, unless something catastrophic had happened. It only had one defensive 7.7mm machine gun, but that was because altitude and endurance were to be the Bernard 82's best defense. Unfortunately, this turned out to not be the case. Prototype testing was plagued by difficulties. The retractable undercarriage was unreliable, which resulted in numerous embarrassing wheels-up landings. The engine's radiators were insufficient for endurance flight. It was slower than expected, with a maximum speed of 317 km an hour against a planned speed which had a minimum of 345, and its so-called high-altitude service ceiling was actually lower than some fighters, which meant that with just a single gun for defense, it amounted to an expensive flying piece of target practice. As it would turn out, France's only successful heavy bomber developed during the interwar period would be the only one that truly felt like a heavy bomber, and that was the Farman F220 and its derivatives. There's already a video on this channel that covers the development of these imposing machines, so I'll keep things relatively brief. While most French bombers built between 1927 and 1933 were as unsuccessful as they were ugly, the heavy Farmans would be the exception that proved the rule. These were built in response to a new specification, issued in 1929, that called for an aircraft that could carry 2 tons of bombs over a range of 2,000 kilometers. In typical French fashion for the time, this program would change its requirements almost as frequently as the French government would change office, but through the chaos, Farman Aviation Works still managed to produce a functioning aircraft. The prototype, the Farman 211, made its maiden flight in October of 1931. It was a high-wing monoplane of mixed construction that was powered by 2 pairs of 300 horsepower Gnome-Rhone radial engines, which were suspended beneath the wings, a somewhat uncommon layout which made the 211 very easy to recognize. It initially proved to be a poor performer, with a top speed of just 195 km an hour and a range of less than 1,000 km. Though modifications in 1932 improved the prototype's performance considerably, Farman decided to take the basic principle of their design and begin again, producing a much larger prototype that was dubbed the F220. This was a much more imposing design. It now featured an all-metal airframe, its wingspan was increased from 25 to 36 meters, and it was now powered by 4 Hispano-Suiza V12s that produced 600 horsepower each, and which drove 4-blade fixed-pitch propellers. After surviving an arduous testing period, which included the requirement to land on cobbled roads 200 times, a typically French thing to request, it was placed into production as the Farman F221. This aircraft had a range of 1,800 kilometers, and with a full bomb load it could still achieve a top speed of 325 kilometers an hour. This meant that the heaviest bombing aircraft in the French Air Force was also pretty much the fastest bombing aircraft in the French Air Force, and to say this caused a certain amount of embarrassment amongst the camp supporting the multi-purpose combat plane would be an understatement. This embarrassment was then continued with the Farman F222, which, amongst other small airframe changes, featured more powerful engines again of 870 horsepower, and also included a retractable landing gear. These carried an even higher payload, with some being capable of carrying almost 4 tons of bombs, and they even had an improved top speed of 350 km an hour. The last of Farman's big bombers to enter service was the F223, which was later renamed the NC223 when the company was nationalized. Unlike the previous models, this one featured more radical design changes. The fuselage was significantly redesigned to both improve strength and reduce weight, and it now had a twin tail arrangement to improve its lateral stability with a full bomb load. The first production model flew at the end of 1939, and the last of a 15-unit production order was ready for service by March of 1940. With these, France possessed one of the most capable heavy bombers in the world when war broke out with Germany in September of 1939. But it was also a very small bomber force. Less than 80 of these aircraft had been produced all up, and as such, they only saw limited nighttime operations. But a single NC-223 did earn the distinction of being the first Allied aircraft to drop bombs on Berlin when it was flown in a daring solo raid on the night of the 7th of June 1940. Again, for more information, I recommend watching the dedicated video I did on these aircraft later. Along with the specification that led to the Farman bombers, another was drawn up that called for more of a medium day-night bomber as well, capable of carrying 1,000 kilos over 1,000 kilometers, and this would lead to the development of one of the only twin-engine French aircraft of this period that did not conform to the Battle-Combat-Reconnaissance aircraft doctrine, and that was the Bloch MB200. Utterly brutal in its appearance, the MB200 was actually a relatively good design, but it fell victim to the rapid advancements being made in aviation technology that left so many aircraft behind between 1933 and 1939. It was built as an all-metal, high-wing cantilever monoplane, and the first prototype made its maiden flight in June of 1933. It had a wingspan of 22.5 meters, a loaded weight of 7.5 tons, and it was powered by 770 horsepower Gnome-Rhone radial engines. This allowed it to carry a bomb load of 1,200 kilograms at an altitude of 8,000 meters with a maximum speed of 285 kilometers an hour. Depending on the mission profile, and depending on what source you read, the MB-200 either had a crew of 4 or 5. It seems that for nighttime operations the crew would consist of 4. A pilot, a bomb aimer/navigator, a radio operator who also could serve as a gunner, and a dedicated gunner. During the day, the additional 5th crew member would be counted in the form of a second dedicated gunner, as the risk of fighter attack was deemed to be far greater during daytime operations versus nighttime operations at this time. Defense from fighters came in the form of 3 machine gun turrets, one in the nose, one in a dorsal position, and a fixed ventral turret which did not retract, as they were sick of having problems with the aforementioned turrets on previous models, and the drag induced by the ventral turret was considered an okay trade-off for the firepower and defense it provided for the aircraft's vulnerable underbelly. Though its top speed of 285 km an hour was a little slower than the requirement, the prototype's range met the target, and its bomb load exceeded it, and so the type was placed into production at the beginning of January 1934. The French Air Force only placed a small order for 30 aircraft at first, but this would quickly expand, and eventually more than 200 would be on order. Additionally, Bloch also received export orders from both Czechoslovakia, who also built it under license, and Spain. The simple construction of the MB-200, which led to its blocky appearance, allowed it to be produced quickly, and within just 6 months, the first aircraft were already being delivered to French squadrons. These bombers were delivered so quickly, in fact, that the operating experience of these early examples made it possible to eliminate a number of identified problems in the design, so that the rest of the production aircraft could be delivered with these improvements. To address problems caused by engine vibration, the engine mounts themselves were reinforced, and they had shock absorbers built into their structure. Additionally, the airframe as a whole had various changes made to it to improve its structural rigidity. Most of the changes were focused on the inner sections of the wings, which had minor changes made to the spars and reinforcements made to the wing ribs, and the center section of the fuselage, which contained the bomb bay, was also strengthened, and bomb racks were installed which allowed the carrying of fewer but much larger bombs. Apart from these changes, the production models differed little from the original prototype, except that the engines now produced an extra 100 horsepower. In total, 332 MB-200s would eventually be built, 208 being manufactured in France, and the rest overseas. Before the last MB-200 had even left the production line, it was obvious that the type would be obsolete before too long. A heavily upgraded version of the aircraft had already been drawn up, and indeed production orders had already been placed. And yet despite this, almost 100 of these obsolete MB-200s would still be based in frontline units on September 3rd, 1939. Indeed, a lot of outdated bombers were still being fielded in 1939. This was because the French bomber force had fallen into something not far removed from a state of total chaos. In fact, it was a fair statement to apply to the entirety of the French Air Force. In the space of just a few short years, changes in government, technology, and doctrine would turn French bomber development on its head and force a rapid scramble to field entirely new types of bombers in a short span of time. Combine this with an underutilized and unprepared aviation industry that failed to meet the demand, and the result was seen in the spring of 1940. Seemingly old and outdated bombers would go into action alongside much newer designs that looked more than a decade more advanced in technology, despite the age gap only being a few years. And it is those new bomber designs that we will be looking at in the second part of this video. If you want to learn more about the development of these early interwar French bombers, I have the following sources and books to recommend. Now, this does not make up the entirety of the source material that I have used for this video, but I would say it is the most important parts of it. And as usual, there will be links to all of these in the video description below. So first up, we have a couple of journal articles which I highly recommend reading. The first one is The Strategic Dream, French Air Doctrine in the Interwar Period, 1919 to 1939, by Robert J. Young. And there is also another article titled Duhay's Antagonist, Amedeo Mukhozy, which was written by Ray Johnson, Paul Tripodi, and Rodolfo Saganga. I think I've pronounced that surname correctly. Now, some of my printed source material is in English, and some of it is in French, so I'll cover the books that are printed in English first. So there is French Bombers of World War II by Jose Fernandez, which was only recently published in 2019, and I think it's a fantastic addition to anyone's collection if they want to look at the history of French aviation in the interwar period and moving into World War II, particularly bombers, of course. There was also The Rise and Fall of the French Air Force by Greg Bowen, which is a fantastic read. Then we have French Aircraft of the First World War by James de Vere and Arthur Salter, which is a great resource to use if you want to just get a general overview of French military aviation in the First World War. And then we have two very popular books for those that like to study French World War II aviation, and this is French Aircraft from 1939 to 1942, Volumes 1 and 2, by Dominique Breffort and André Junio. I don't think I pronounced that surname correctly at all, I apologize. And my other English sources are various articles from Flight International magazine and Flying Review magazine, of which I have a few hundred in my own personal collection, which I've either found at various secondhand shops over the years, and some I've even had very kindly donated to me by various viewers of the channel. Now, as for French sources, we have got Les Avions Potez by Jean-Louis Corolla and Michael Ledet. I've probably pronounced that wrong again. And then we have Les Avions Breguet, which comes in Volume 1 and Volume 2, both written by Henri Lacaze. Then we have Les Avions Farman and Les Avions Bernard, which are both written by Jean Lioré. And finally, two Italian sources, which I also used. One was The Command of the Air by Giulio Duhay. I have two copies in my collection. One is a recent print from only a few years ago, and one is, I believe it's a second edition from 1943, 1944. It's old, it's dusty, but there are some differences between the two versions, mostly additions by later authors and editors, which make one of the newer versions of the book probably a better read, because they also add considerations of hindsight, etc. into the book, which makes for an interesting read. And finally, we have The War on the Defenseless and Assault Aviation by Amedeo Mukhozy. This last one is particularly difficult to track down, as A, it wasn't printed in huge numbers, and B, there is no English translation. I believe it is only in Italian. However, if that's something you're interested in, I highly recommend it. It's a very interesting read if you can muddle your way through reading Italian. But as always, thank you all so much for watching, and a big thank you, of course, to the Patreon supporters, many of whom voted for this video. And I really hope you all enjoyed it. This was my first attempt at making this sort of video, and almost all of this was done without a dedicated script, so hopefully it wasn't too rambly. I'm trying my best to not be so reliant on scripts anymore. I'm trying to sort of present things a bit more naturally, but if it's coming across as a bit too weird or a bit too rambly, let me know, and I might work on more dedicated scripts again for these sort of videos in the future. A big thank you, of course, to our Wing Commander tier patrons, our highest tier supporters, and a warm welcome to M50 Ontos, who is the newest member of this special group, and a wonderful addition to the Rex's Hangar Defense Force with those recoilless rifles. So thank you so much for your patronage. And the feedback on the new system with Patreon in regards to the votes has been great, and I'm going to continue doing it, and I cannot wait to see what other suggestions patrons come up with in the future. So great to see that this is becoming a popular thing to do with the channel supporters. But as always, thank you all so much for your continued support, and I will catch you all next time for part 2. Goodbye.